good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Kevin Welding. I'm the Associate Director of the Institute for Global Tobacco Control at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Thanks for joining us for our latest talk in the Innovations in Tobacco Control lecture series. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Belén Sáenz de Miera Juárez. Belén is a lecturer at the Autonomous University of Baja California Sur in La Paz, Mexico. She has been a consultant for the World Bank and the World Health Organization, among other institutions. She collaborates on various research projects with the National Institute of Public Health in Mexico and the Health Policy Department at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She started her academic career at the Center for Economic Research and Teaching in Mexico City, before receiving a master's degree in economics from the University of York in the United Kingdom, and a PhD in social policy from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her main areas of interest for research are public health and microeconometrics. Her work has been published in peer-reviewed journals such as Health Economics and Tobacco Control. For 15 years, she has worked in the area of tobacco taxes in Mexico, including those that help support the tax increases that were approved in 2011 and 2020 in Mexico. I've had the pleasure of working with Belén on multiple projects, including the work she will talk about today. Tobacco industry pricing strategies during recent tax adjustments in Mexico, evidence from commercial data. If you'd like to ask any questions along the way, use the Q&A box that you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. So now I'll hand it over to Belén.
Thank you, Kevin, for the nice introduction, and also thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. I'll start sharing my screen. Please let me know if everything's fine. So you should be looking at it now. And as Kevin mentioned, I'll be presenting the results of a study we recently conducted. It's about tobacco industry pricing strategies. And we used the case of Mexico because there was very recently a tax adjustment, so that gave us the opportunity to explore a bit more how these pricing strategies work. So here's just an outline of the presentation. The usual stuff. First, I'll give you the background. Then I'm going to explain the methods, the data we used, and the analysis we conducted. Then I'm going to summarize the main results. I'll discuss a bit those results, and then we'll have this Q&A session. And I'll be very happy to try to answer your questions and also to hear your comments about the study. So I'm going to start with the background. So probably we all know probably here that tobacco taxation is a very effective intervention. We know that taxes increase prices, and then this increase in prices influence consumers' behavior, so that they reduce their consumption, also prevents initiation and increases cessation. And there's now a lot of evidence about this, and we know it's included as a key component of tobacco control in the FCTC and also in the WHO Empower package to help countries to combat the tobacco epidemic. But as I mentioned, like when we increase taxes, we increase prices because, well, prices are increased because taxes are normally a large component of prices. But actually, since the tobacco industry is highly concentrated, transnational companies usually have plenty pricing power so that they can respond to excise taxes in different ways to maximize their profits. So the pass-through of taxes, it's not always homogeneous, and it's not always like a complete pass-through. So this effectiveness of tobacco taxation really depends on this pass-through, and this is a very recent literature review about pricing strategies found evidence of this behavior to try to undermine tobacco taxation. So these are the main pricing strategies that they found. So first of all, they can use, the industry can use differential shifting of taxes, like a pass-through is not homogeneous for all type of products. Also, sometimes they launch new brands or new products. There's also been found evidence of price discrimination, like different prices for different types of consumers, and also price-related promotions. There's also a strategy that's been called price smoothing, which is like smooth the tax increase, like not increasing prices immediately. Also, the number of cigarettes per pack can be reduced. No, like instead of having the usual 20 cigarettes pack, then smaller pack sizes can be introduced in the market. And finally, other strategy that has been found is changing the product attributes, like, for example, the length of the cigarettes. So all these, as I mentioned, is this literature review that went through all the evidence on pricing strategies. This is like the strategies that have been identified. So, for example, in the UK, where a lot of this research has been made, they found that undershifting is commonly employed. So to keep cheaper prices, cheaper brands, relatively cheaper. No, but this evidence is mostly concentrated in high-income countries. And little is known about the use of such strategies in low and middle income countries. So in Mexico, we had some evidence. It's evidence from a decade ago, a bit more than a decade. But what we had seen specifically in Mexico, well, first of all, I have to mention that in Mexico, the tobacco tax is a mixed tax. So it has an ad valorem component and then a specific component. So in 2008, 2009, there was a minor tax increase in the ad valorem component. And what we observed is that as a response of this increase, the relative price of national brands, which are still more cheaper, was reduced. So the gap between segments was actually increased. But then in 2011, when there was a substantial tax increase in the specific, not the ad valorem, but now the specific component, this actually had the opposite effect. And this managed to reduce some of these price differentials between premium and discount brands. Then in between 2011, 2019, for many years, fiscal policy remained unchanged. So in those years, tobacco industry pricing strategies in Mexico actually focus more on positioning its products. And we see that very clear because Pall Mall is the only brand that registered a very rapid growth in that period. And evidence suggests that it's because a combination of relatively low prices and a very intensive use of capsules, which are very popular in Mexico. And now, this is what we actually we're going to be analyzing. Finally, in 2 years ago, in 3 years now, in 2020, there was an adjustment in the specific component to account for all the accumulated inflation in the previous 9 years, because in all these years that nothing happened regarding tax policy in Mexico, there was not even an adjustment for inflation. So in 2020, finally, the specific component was adjusted. And you can see in the table well, we had this ad valorem component that hasn't changed, but then the specific component in 2019 is what it was 35 cents per cigarette. And then in 2020, after this adjustment, it was increased to almost 50 cents. And then something else that was implemented was an automatic mechanism so that every year, this adjustment for inflation, we didn't have to go through Congress to do again this adjustment, but it is now an automatic adjustment. So in 2021, for example, this adjustment meant an increase to 51 cents. And this increase in the tax is what we are going to analyze to see how the industry responded and if they use some pricing strategies of those that I summarized earlier. So the objective is to assess whether this recent tax change in Mexico was fully passed on to consumer, but also we wanted to see whether this pass-through was heterogeneous across different attributes. Like I mentioned, cigarettes with capsules are very popular in Mexico, and I actually think there's going to be a lecture about that later, the next month. So we didn't know if, for example, pricing strategies differ for these types of very popular cigarettes, but also we analyze what happened with pack sizes, different pack sizes, or different flavors. And we use commercial data from Nielsen, and I'm going to tell you a bit more about this data. Probably you've heard about this data because it's been used in other countries, like in the studies I mentioned for the UK. But it was very important for us to have this information because it was the first time that we had such detailed information about the Mexican cigarette market. So the data, it's national data on cigarette prices that covers a 3-year period. So we have information for 36 months from October 2018 to September 2021. And as I said, it was acquired from the Nielsen company, which is a market research company that collects information about the tobacco market globally, but specifically it collects information from Mexico. And data is collected through 2 types of trade channels. So we have the modern channels, which include supermarkets, convenience stores, pharmacies, government-owned retail outlets. And in this type of modern channels, what they use is point-of-sale scanners. So every time cigarettes are purchased in these type of stores, you know that the product is scanned and then this information is stored. And then in traditional outcomes, traditional channels, sorry, like traditional stores, mini marts, booths, kiosks, they use field audit. So it's a bit different, but then we have information from all these trade channels that actually represent most of the purchases in Mexico. And as I mentioned, we have the very detailed information because we can identify the manufacturer, the brand, variant, flavor, pack size, cigarette size, and also the presence of capsules. So we have a sample of nearly 6,000 observations with complete price information. And the analysis we conducted, well, first we did some descriptive analysis just to get a sense of the data and what happened with the prices in this period. So we checked the trends, and then we did some simple t-tests to compare average prices before and after the tax increase for the same month, like for example, January 2020 with January 2019, just to see what happened with prices in this period. And then we did some, we ran some models. Since this tax is the same across the country, we cannot actually have like a control group. So we used another approach to compare the outcome of interest, that is prices, before and after the implementation of the tax. So basically, we use this fixed effects model by product, where we have the dependent variable Y are prices of product I in month M, year Y. And then we have like the main variables of interest are these indicator variables, tax 2020 and tax 2021, which take the value of 0 before the implementation of the tax, and then the value of 1 from time of implementation. We also included an indicator variable for 2018, so that our reference year, so we are comparing basically what happened with prices with respect to 2019, which was just before the tax increase. Then we are including a linear time trend, and then we see the fixed effects by products, which allows to capture all non-time varying characteristics, like, for example, quality, because it's something that it's unobservable and it's something that could change. So these fixed effects capture capture this, and the usual error term. So that was like the main specification. But then we ran additional specifications, like, for example, including dummies for each month of 2020, which allows to capture nonlinear changes after the tax increase. So that was something important to test for this price smoothing strategy, for example. We also tried interactions between the tax indicator variables and the time trend to test whether trends in prices had a change after the tax increase. We also tried a dynamic specification with lags of the dependent variable. We also did aggregated models by month. So basically, we aggregate all the information by month and then estimated the model, just to, we lose variation, of course, which is something very important, but we wanted to see if the models were consistent. And finally, we also tried an alternative definition of the intervention that considered that the tax increase was announced before the actual implementation, which is something that usually happens in all the countries, but particularly in Mexico, since this is discussed during November, more or less, in Congress. We know from then if there's going to be a change in tobacco taxation. So this increase was actually announced in November 2019. This alternative definition considered that probably from the date of announcement, something had happened with prices. We'll see the results in a minute. So the main results, I try to use, I'm going to show you some tables, but I try to use graphs because I know it's very complicated to look at small numbers, but so this is like the first, descriptive analysis, just to see what happened with trends in cigarette prices during the period under study. And what we see is the vertical red line shows or indicates the tax adjustment of 2020. It was implemented in January. And then the vertical green line indicates the other minor tax adjustment of January 2021. And what we see is like a very clear jump in after the tax increase of 2020. And in general, we see that there was an overall 12 price increase in between 2019 and 2020. So we do see a clear association between the tax increase and the price and a price increase. And when we look at these trends for different cigarette attributes, I'm just using as, we have more graphs, but I couldn't show you all. So I just took these examples, which show, for example, in the right, you see what happened with prices of cigarettes with capsules and without capsules, which I mentioned that are very popular in Mexico. So the blue line represents cigarettes with capsules, which are generally more expensive. And we see actually in both cases, like in both cigarettes with and without capsules, we also see like this very clear price increase after the tax adjustment. And then on the left, you see the trends, but these are by brand. Well, it's it's like the main brands and best, like the best, like the more popular brands. And we also see that there is a clear increase in the price after the tax increase. But I'll go back, sorry, to the previous slide, because I want you to look at something, and it's that although we do very clearly see that there was this a jump after the tax increase, you can also see that and you also see it in the other graphs, but I think this is bigger, so it's more clear. And you can also see that the price increase was not like a one-time thing. No, it was like more gradual during the first months of the year, which is something that's been seen in other countries. So as I mentioned, you can actually see it here, but it's a bit more difficult to distinguish. Sorry. Sorry, excuse me. So a few other things. This is not strictly related to the price increases, but just also to give you like an idea of other characteristics of the Mexican cigarette market that was very obvious from the descriptive analysis. So you saw that the best-selling brands are clearly grouped in three segments. And then we have other brands which are not so popular that are in a ultra low segment, but the best-selling brands are clearly grouped in three segments. Then we also see that, as I mentioned, capsule and mint flavor cigarettes play an important role, and they have market shares like capsule cigarettes, 35% of the total market, and mint flavor cigarettes, 25%. Marlboro remains the best-selling brand, and 20 cigarette packs are the most common in Mexico. Now, going back to the effect of taxes on prices, these are the results of the main specification, like the simplest model, the one I showed, the equation. And again, we see very clear, this is the coefficient for the tax 2020 variable, and these are the coefficients for the tax 2021 for the other adjustment for inflation. And the models are disaggregated, so this is for the full sample, and then are disaggregated according to presence of capsules or by flavor or by market segment. As I mentioned, the best-selling brands are grouped in these premium, medium, discount segments. And then we have an ultra-low segment of small brands that are very cheap. And then we have the most common sizes of packs in Mexico, which are 20 cigarette packs and 14 and 20 cigarette packs. And we clearly see that the tax increase of 2020 is associated with a price increase. So in particular, the price increase 17 cents on average. And there seems to be some difference, but look at the confidence intervals. Most of these differences are not significant, except for this ultra low segment. I'm going to say a bit more about this later. But in general, we do see the association of tax changes and prices, and we see that this was the case for different cigarette attributes. The other minor tax adjustment, it's not only for some of the characteristics. We see the price increase, but this was the largest tax increase, and it's very clear that there was an increase in prices which is actually consistent with the graphs that I showed before. But these are the results for the other model that allowed for a nonlinear increase during 2020, and this is also consistent with what I mentioned with what we looked at, what we saw in the other graphs, in the first graphs that I showed, and it's that we again see the price increase, but we also see that the price increase was gradual during the first months of 2020. Specifically, for example, in here, in the graph on the right, the red line shows the trend in prices for cigarettes in the mid segment. And what we see is like in January, there was like the first month where when the tax was implemented, we actually don't see a significant price increase, but the price increase started until February, and then it was gradual until April. So it is more clear there. And then we have this special case of the ultra low segment where of the discount segment, which is the green line, where we see a very sharp increase in January, but then we see that during the rest of the year, actually prices went back to pre-tax levels. So these two, but especially the case of discount brands, is different, and in the rest of for the rest of the models, disaggregated for different attributes. Like for example, on the left, you see what happened with cigarettes with capsules and cigarettes without capsules, and we see again this gradual increase. And basically, if I showed you the models disaggregated by flavor or by pack size, we would see something very similar. These are the results of the aggregate model, which are the coefficients are a bit larger, but generally consistent. So we see like very clear the increase after the tax increase is the first vertical dotted line, and well, we see very clear again the price increase after the tax adjustment. And And then these are the results from the other specification that looks at whether price changes began with not with the tax implementation, but with the tax announcement. As I mentioned, it was announced in November 2019. But what we see is that these coefficients from 2019 are not statistically significant. So this basically indicates that that price increases or price changes began with tax implementation from January. And finally, I'm not including the results because I thought I had already put a lot of tables and graphs. I hope that all the story makes sense. But we also tried these other specifications that I mentioned before. So we had some dynamic models. And in this case, point estimates were slightly lower. Remember that from the main model, we had a 17 cents price increase, and now we have a 15 cents price increase, but is within the margins of the main specification. So actually, dynamic models were also very consistent. And we also tested these possible changes in trends after the tax implementation. Actually, we could see from the, in the first graphs that this didn't happen to be the case, no? But still we ran these models and we tested for this potential change in trend, and we found no evidence of such a change, which is consistent with what we had observed in the descriptive analysis. So just to summarize the main findings, we see a very clear market segmentation by price, which is something that had been is consistent with previous evidence for Mexico. And I think that it's actually very common in most countries to see this market segmentation. We also see that the tax change from 2020 is clearly associated with a price increase. And we see that this, in other words, that we see this pass through of the tax. And we also see that when we disaggregate the models by product characteristics. But I think that the most important thing to stress here is that we found evidence of these pricing strategies that had been observed in other countries. In particular, we find evidence of price smoothing, which is, this gradual price increase. And this was especially clear for mid-segment brands. As I mentioned, actually what we see is that in the first month of the tax implementation, the price of these brands was not increased, but it was until the following month, and it was a very gradual increase until during the first months of the year. And finally, we have this special case of discount brands where we do see like this it's the opposite from mid-segment brands. We do see a very steep increase when the tax was implemented, but then something happens, and during the year, the prices return to pre-tax levels. So this means that the gap in prices between discount brands and premium brands actually increased. Of course, the analysis has some limitations. We are not considering informal trade channels. And this includes the sales of single cigarettes. And it's important to mention because single cigarettes are popular in Mexico. It's forbidden, but it's a common practice. And well, we didn't have data from single cigarettes, so we could not consider what happened with single cigarettes. In the study that I mentioned before, that analyzed what happened over a decade ago, it showed that the pass-through for single cigarettes had also been similar, but now we didn't have information to see what happened. And also, well, of course, the results are only valid for the trade channels assessed, which are those that I described when I described the data. But also, as I mentioned, most purchases are made through those channels. So that's actually something good for us. And now the conclusions, I'll try to summarize. So recent tobacco tax adjustments in Mexico, especially the 2020 tax adjustment, is associated with the cigarette price increases. But consistent with the previous research, we found that the tobacco industry may use a series of pricing strategies, such as price smoothing, to try to reduce the effectiveness of tax increases. So it is important to continue monitoring these practices and try to anticipate potential effects. And this is something that we found before, and is that substantial increases in specific taxes instead of ad valorem may be more effective in countering such pricing strategies. And I think that's it. Thank you. And I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Belén. I think, thanks for doing this research and this presentation. I think Nielsen data is a little trickier to work with than a lot of people think. I think it is good that they have both some of the scanner type data where you have a UPC code and it goes over a scanning machine, but it also has a bit of field audit data as well, where data collectors actually go in and sort of see what's for sale. So I think it's good. And when I always look at, I guess when I start looking at research, I always do this sort of a sniff test to see if things kind of just make sense. Like, would it make sense to like anyone that you presented this to? And I think this does. I think it passes that sniff test. I mean, it's good to see that the bigger tax change in 2020 had a bigger impact on the price, and the smaller tax change had a smaller impact. It's kind of what you would expect. Another comment I think is just, I want to say, because I always find it sort of, I don't know if it's disheartening or just an observation, that the tobacco industry does have a lot of power and sort of a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy that they can, when they say that a tax might not have a biggest effect as you might think it will. And we always talk about taxes being regressive, possibly, or I guess they always roll out the argument that the tax change could be regressive. And we know from other research that once you incorporate benefits related to healthcare costs, a lot of those tax changes are actually progressive. But I think there is some irony that if the industry is sort of absorbing some of those tax changes for the lowest price tiers, they might actually be trying to, or actually be making those tax changes a little more regressive than they should be by manipulating that pass through. So I think it is just an important thing. I think it's always important to actually, study after the fact these tax changes and price changes, because we can't assume that everything gets passed through the way theory would have you believe. I wanted to ask one question, sort of as I will pretend, or maybe not pretend, to be a naive observer of policy in Mexico, and say, like, where does the status of using discounts and coupons and promotions stand in Mexico? Because I imagine this sort of manipulation of passing a tax through might be even more important in places where you don't have any other way for the industry to discount or for the consumer to get a discount. Yeah, so is there any other type of discounting available to the industry or to consumers in Mexico?
Thank you, Kevin. You actually know a lot about this. But well, you know that discounts and coupons, especially coupons and that type of things, are not allowed. And as far as I know, they are not like a common practice. And but you know, it's a good point, because it's something that we cannot see in the data that we are using. So that could actually be a limitation. But at least as far as I know, it's a strategy that it's not so widely used in Mexico, but there's evidence that it's being used in other countries. So I'm sure that could be a more important limitation, you know, if we know that that's happening and we don't take that into account.
So I'll ask one question that we got from the audience, and I guess it might have been referenced to us or to the presentation talking about like the pass-through of the tax to the price, and the individual says it doesn't necessarily look like a bad thing. It looks like in most of these things the tax is at least fully passed to the prices, and that's kind of what we expect when we see a tax change, and it seems to be the case in the evidence that you have. So did you actually, like, across all the tiers and category, and I don't think you presented everything that you looked at, but across any of the segments that you looked at, were there any cases where taxes weren't actually passed to the consumer, that the pass-through wasn't full?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, first of all, I don't know, because what in this case, as you mentioned at the beginning, we are actually looking at what we would expect, no, to see the pass-through, and it's of course more obvious for the larger 2020 tax increase. But as I mentioned before, it doesn't have to be the case, no. Like, for example, when we had these tax increases by the end of the you know, in 2008, 2009, we didn't see this full pass through for all the brands. So price strategies do change, no. So now we are looking at a more clear pass through, but it doesn't mean that it's been always the same in Mexico, and of course if we compare to other countries. But I think for this 2020 tax adjustment in general, like I mentioned, we do very clearly see the tax increase. But also I highlighted the case of discount brands, because you know, it was actually something that I wasn't expecting, because it's very obvious, like the price increase right after the tax became in force. But then we see this return to pre-tax levels. So, you know, I think that the message here is that these price strategies can evolve. No, it's like some, you know, at the beginning there can be like a reaction, like immediate reaction, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to change in the following months. So that's what I highlighted that case, because I thought it was interesting to see that. Well, for me, I would say it's strange pattern, no? Like first a very clear pass through, 100% pass through, but then like something happened, no? And it's very clear. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think it does. I think it is sort of quirky data to work with, and you can't exactly see whether it's fully passed through for everything, but I think you can do some of that. We have a couple more questions, and I'm probably going to combine some of the things that I jotted down with these questions because they're pretty aligned. So let me start with this one. And so in your limitations, you said that the informal market isn't really captured outside of just that field audit. I think in the field audit data, you can end up with some illicit packs possibly. And it's a little tricky to identify those, but I think it's possible. And I think it's something that we've discussed. But definitely single sticks are kind of missing from this equation. And obviously, if we're looking at something like downshifting to a cheaper product, then maybe that, you know, if that's your outcome, you might be in trouble. But I guess in these results, you know, where we're looking at how the tax is passed to price, I think the limitation of not having that, like some of the informal market in the single sticks, isn't too detrimental. One of the questions from the audience was, and I don't know if you can answer this or if you've tried to look at it, and you might actually have knowledge outside of what you presented here today too, but do you think this increase in taxes that created an increase in the prices in cigarettes have actually increased any illegal or illicit tobacco sales in Mexico?
Thank you. Yeah, we always have that questions about the illicit market, which is important. Well, I don't know if I can say that, or we are actually right now conducting a study on illicit trade to see what's happened in these years. Until I have the results, I cannot give you, like, you know, a straight answer of, but again, I can speak from what we saw in the past. And this tax increase of 2011, it was a very important, a very substantial tax increase. And the evidence that we have, which is not as good as the evidence that we are collecting right now, but we don't see a sharp increase in illicit trade. Actually, illicit trade is well below global average in Mexico. But we'll have more precise information about that soon. And I think we're probably going to see the same, but yeah, we're working on that.
Yeah, I think one thing that people often forget, or maybe, is that the market is really heterogeneous. There isn't just one price for cigarettes. So if you increase that one price, if there was only one price, then maybe, yeah, people would shift to a different market, and that being like the black market or the informal market or something like that. But there's such a big range of prices for cigarettes. Like we saw the 4 different price tiers that you presented. And so whenever you have any price increase, people have the opportunity to just shift amongst legal products before they make a decision to go to illicit or illegal products. And I think often we also talk about that, you know, with any price increase, illicit trade is not a sort of a foregone conclusion. There's definitely things you can do on the supply side of track and trace that can really control any effect that there might be at those really ultra low price points that like may put people into a decision to think about the informal market, or just shifting to single stick sales, which technically are illegal sales. So yeah, I don't think that's the type of illicit we often think about, but it could shift some consumers to single sticks as well. The other question that we got was about, and I think you touched upon this, it was in the objectives, and I think your table on one of your slides talked about it, but you didn't spend like a ton of time talking about it. You briefly said that, you know, a lot of the confidence intervals sort of overlapped. But the question was, did the tax changes result in any changes in product attributes? And I think what you did present was whether we saw different pass-throughs for different types of attributes in terms of pack size or stick size, or I guess number of sticks, and capsules or not having capsules, or some of the flavor stuff. And I'm going to attach my question onto this. Is you presented a lot of the price information that Nielsen has, but they also have a lot of quantity information too. And you could, and I'm sure if you've had time, you've probably been interested enough to look at whether some of these price changes actually did have an effect on the quantity that was sold for different categories. And I think that's a little bit what this question is getting at as well. And I know this is another good plug for Toyen's presentation next month, which is also related to this data, where she does look a little bit more at the same time period, which happened to have 2 tax increases, and she looks at whether the sort of the capsule market really evolved in any ways. So yeah, I don't know if you can say much to this, but if you want to have anything to say about whether these tax changes sort of had any changes in the product attributes that we were seeing.
Yeah, I was going to say that Toyen is going to explain that much better than me, because she's gone into a lot of detail. But yeah, actually, what we see is that and that's something interesting, that the market of cigarettes with capsules continues increasing in Mexico. And as I showed, capsules, cigarettes with capsules are more expensive in general, are more in like the mid premium segment, and when some of these, like I also mentioned a bit about the Pall Mall brand, which had this very large increase in market share. And when it was first introduced, the industry clearly used pricing strategies, because it was introduced, you know, like this brand with the features of premium brands, but with a relatively lower price. But now we see that the price has that now this brand is it's not anymore a discount brand, so the price has increased, and still we I mean, what I want to say is that probably when it was introduced, this price strategy was important, but now that it's well settled in the market, and what we see is that these that prices are actually are higher for these types of cigarettes, and we still see this very large growth in the cigarette in the share of cigarettes with capsules. I don't know if I can say something about other characteristics, because I think that the what's more interesting is this important increase in the share of cigarettes with capsules. But yeah, as I mentioned, I think Toyen is going to present more details about this.
Yeah, more to come there. I mean, I think your results about price smoothing are very interesting. I also thought it was quite interesting that you didn't see a big price jump after the announcement a couple months before the tax change. And I think it would be very interesting to see whether people were stockpiling a little bit, whether we see any spikes in quantity before those taxes actually came into effect. I think we have time for one more question, and I'll sort of leave it with a policy question. And I don't know if this is going to be $1 million question or a question that like you cannot answer, but I feel like I should ask it anyway. If we do see some of this behavior, is there policy mechanisms that can stop it or attenuate it in any way? And I'm talking about, you know, maybe it's the announcement, like, so let's say we find stockpiling. Is there a way that you can announce these tax changes in a way that wouldn't create, you know, is it completely a surprise the day it happens? For the price smoothing, for any of the sort of, you know, manipulation of the pass through by different price tiers, is there anything you can think of that you could do from a policy perspective to sort of have an impact here? You know, I think when people advocate for these price changes and these tax changes, it's generated out of there are going to be health benefits from this, not just revenue benefits for the government. And if you do see the industry manipulating those price changes, the consumer might never see those health benefits from quitting or reducing their consumption of cigarettes. like my guess is that minimum price laws would help a little bit for some of it, maybe outlawing coupons and discounts. But is there anything else that you can think of that would help, I guess, with the industry's sort of, I mean, to some degree, they're a big market player for their own market. So I don't know if there's an answer, but yeah, do you have any thoughts?
You stole my words, because I was going to say, I think yeah, because it's the first thing that comes to our mind. No, like some countries do have these minimum price policies, minimum price laws, and I also think that with respect to coupons and things like that, is more relatively easier to implement policies to regulate that. I think that that's probably the easiest, the easier strategies to combat. But then, for example, we have this price smoothing thing that we very clearly see in Mexico. And to be honest, I've been thinking about this a lot. And as you mentioned, the industry is a big player, and there's not, to be honest, I don't think there's much we can do about that. As I mentioned, always a large tax increase instead of, because we've had that in Mexico, no, like short, gradual tax increases. And it's more difficult for the industry to respond to a very large tax increase. So I think that that's something that works much better than small gradual increases, and always is much better to increase specific components, as I mentioned. But apart from that, I think it's a question that we're going to leave also for the audience, and to think a bit more about that, because yeah, it's like to be honest, it's a natural reaction, you know, from the industry.
Yeah, and but I think you're right. I think we shouldn't do this price smoothing for them through policy. So I think that's a good thing. And I think doing research like this and making it sort of publicly known that the tobacco industry might be manipulating their own consumers' behavior is something to be said. So I see we're at time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I want to thank you for sharing everything you did today with us, and for your work in tobacco control. And I want to thank everyone who joined us today, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye, everybody.
Thanks a lot.